Hello, welcome back to the Wide Comics podcast, about telling stories about how comic books impact. I'm your host, Jesse, and with me today is an Eisner Award winner for comic book coverage and someone who I learned very recently has a lot to say about Captain America First Avenger. It's Caitlin Rosberg.
that is that is seriously so this is like a very tangential aside from the things we want to talk about, but I've seen almost every Marvel movie in theaters the day it came out, right? Like that's the way it was. But then the second time I watched Captain America First Avenger was in my friend's house with some of their friends that I'd never met before.
Okay.
So this was, mutual friends that I did not know. I ended up sitting next to someone who is now a very dear friend of mine named Rebecca. And I kept muttering under my breath every time there was a problem with what was on screen. And I didn't realize that I was doing it until Rebecca just like busted up laughing and was like, this is the most delightful Mystery Science Theater 3000 version of a Marvel movie I've ever seen. This is great. Can you please just say it out loud? Because I'm missing some of what you're pissed about. So that is kind of my claim to fame, is that movie has made me friends because it makes me so angry.
I can't think of a movie that made me like really angry. I've been watching through the Fast and Furious franchise with friends recently, and we watched through Tokyo Drift and 4 yesterday. And I'm watching Tokyo Drift. I'm watching the beginning of it, and I'm like, there is no reason that any of this should be happening. Like, there's just no real reason that this country boy should be in Japan. And I was like, upset. I'm like, am I actually mad at a movie for the first time? Like,
that's fine though.
Yeah, and then the racing happened, and I kind of got over it. But it was just like, man, this inciting incident is just ridiculous.
I think my biggest thing with Captain America: The First Avenger specifically, and I did say this on Twitter, what a lot of people don't know about me is my dad's a veteran. There's a lot of veterans in my family, and in my house, nobody in my family is like super big into sports. Like, you have to go out to like cousins and so on to find someone that like loves baseball or something, right? So in my family on Sundays, we didn't watch football, we didn't watch baseball, we watched old movies on like Turner Classic Movies or AMC or whatever. And one of the things that my dad does is he counts bullets. So if you're watching a Western, like you're watching a John Wayne movie and he's got a 5-shot revolver and 7 bullets come out of it, like that's something he does. And especially as a veteran, he like when we watch stuff like World War II movies, he talks to me about like what's wrong with parts of it, or like especially if it's something that was based in Asia Pacific, because he's a Vietnam veteran. So there's a John Wayne movie where the sun sets over the East China Sea while he's in China. So the sun sets in the east, and like that's the last shot of the movie. And like it's just ridiculous. And that's the sort of thing that like it was so ingrained in my brain that like when I started watching Captain America: The First Avenger, I was like, nobody has any ranks on their uniforms. Why is everybody wearing a hat inside? Like, those are like incredibly basic, like, and I said this on Twitter as well, but like World War II is one of the best documented conflicts in history, just in terms of like knowing what people did, why they did it, who was wearing what, who was using which weapons, like all of that stuff, incredibly well documented. It is the backbone of the History Channel, and like they just fucking ignored all of it. And that kind of drove me bonkers, because it is a fundamental part of Captain America's backstory, is that it's World War II specifically. It's Nazis specifically. And if you ignore some of the context, it feels really weird to me to be like, we're going to talk about World War II, but we're going to ignore the realities of World War II. And this is my larger thing about Marvel versus DC, that Marvel movies especially are so specifically rooted in actual history and real places that when you ignore the contexts of that history and those places, you're ignoring people. You're ignoring people that actually lived and died. And that feels really disrespectful to me. Is like, I get it. It's more fun to say, Peter Parker's in New York City versus Batman is in Gotham. But like, it feels real weird to erase actual things that have happened. And I know that that's like a weird thing that not everybody attaches themselves to, but for me, it's important. So yes, Captain America: The First Avenger, not my favorite.
It's really weird. Like, and this podcast wasn't really going to be on movies, but I don't get to talk about superhero movies too often with other people. But it is weird that the Marvel movies have this weird thing where they want to be realistic in a lot of ways. But they also kind of want to embrace the quality of serials from the 50s, 60s era and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so they play up to a level of silliness that depends on the director, really what you're gonna get. But the Captain America movie was the first one at least, was so interested in being that propaganda comic feeling
Yep.
that it kind of just didn't really give enough into what's actually going on. Because even if you read the comics, like they take off their hats when they go into rooms, they have like ranks on their, like, 'cause I've been reading old Caps, so I see these things, like they're actually trying to make it more military in there, but they're too interested in like the visual of like, this is what those old like ads look like, let's make the whole movie look like that, than it is maybe let's make it a realistic war movie.
Yeah. And I think a lot of that has to do with like when the Captain America comics originally started, it was being done by people that had actually lived through World War II, right? Yeah, like that was a very directly lived experience. And by the time we're getting to, the 2000s, there's not that many people around that survived it. And like, I haven't watched Falcon and Winter Soldier yet. I almost said the Twitter name. Can I swear? Is that okay if I swear on this?
Fine. Yeah.
I almost said Bucky and Fucky because that's what all of my friends call it. I haven't watched it yet. A lot of my friends tell me that like it addresses some of my biggest problems with the MCU writ large, which are almost exclusively very rooted in what we've been talking about. And then also specifically the veteran experience of like PTSD, the VA, like I know that Bucky and Steve missed out on the GI Bill, but like the GI Bill was such a fundamental part of the World War II veteran experience. And I also have like a big, I'll admit it, I hate the MCU version of Peggy Carter.
Yeah, I guess
it was a sexy lamp problem. Like she served no purpose in that first movie. She was just there to be there.
I don't know if
whereas like the 616. So the 616 version of Peggy Carter, she is part of the Vichy France resistance. Okay. She's actually an American woman that went to France to become part of the Vichy France resistance. And like she's very much like a along the lines of like a Lois Lane. Like she's in your face. She's very much like Steve was not as aggressively anti-Nazi as she wanted him to be in some cases.
Gotcha.
And like that's actually a significantly more compelling idea to me, to have a woman who's there for a reason, who is based on like real things that actual women did in the actual war, rather than this like random lady who's just walking around in an olive drab dress that doesn't indicate anything.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. So yeah, that's not my comics origin story. That's not why I think comics matter, but that is something about comics that I think matters that often gets left behind. So
and
yeah.
Honestly, really speaking about like how the Marvel Cinematic Universe treats like military things, watching Falcon and Winter Soldier and watching the latter half of the Captain America trilogy, you really see that it's a post-Iraq war that they're really hitting, not a post like World War II cap, because how much they deal with the military tactics, and like even in like Age of Ultron and stuff, it's very much like what we've been known to be documented in the Iraq war and stuff, good or bad, like that is what they're tackling, and very much so it feels like in Falcon Winter Soldier, like how like Sam, his tactics and how he tries to de-escalate or how he does combat, it feels like, oh, this is someone who's way more focused on modern wars than old wars, and that's maybe why the first Avenger suffers so much, is because we were so hyper focused on what's going on currently.
Well, and a lot of it also has to do with the monetary relationship that Marvel has with the military. Like there's a monetary relationship there, and like I don't know if you remember this, but the Northrop Grumman comic that they published a couple years ago about how drone missiles are great, actually, like there's a bunch of other stuff that has to do with like Marvel's militarism that feels very uncomfortable in a lot of different ways. But like for me at least, and I mean, all you have to do is look at my Twitter and I know this, my favorite MCU character is Rhodey. James Rhodes is my ride or die. Like that's my guy, right? And the fact that we had the potential for a relationship between Bucky and Rhodey, like they have so much in common, and they've literally never interacted on screen. Like, and like, there's all sorts of like layered problems to the way that the military is discussed and talked about. And like, I got really excited when I saw Winter Soldier, because Sam was working at the VA as a young veteran interacting with older veterans, and that the gulf between even just Gulf War veterans and Iraq War veterans who were fighting in the same place, just like 20 years apart, right? Or the massive, like, it's a chasm between guys my dad's age who went to Vietnam and guys Sam's age who were in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? Like there's a huge cultural shift between those two groups, and the VA is the bridge that could bring them back together, because nobody's going to like VFWs or whatever. And then like we never talked about Sam's relationship with the VA ever again until Falcon and Winter Soldier. And I'm like, but this is backwards storytelling. Like you can't tell me and not show me. You can't convince me that this was happening in the background between movies. We should have gotten this TV show 5 years ago. Yeah. Because that's the only way that you could get that like effective emotional investment. So yeah. There's a very brief version of the MCU rant. I would be happy to talk to you about superhero movies anytime.
We might come back to that near the end, because I have a question kind of about superhero movies later for the small Q&A section. But what I want to move on to your history though with comics. Like, where did you start reading, start buying, start watching everything?
Yeah, so I have said this proudly, loudly, in public, repeatedly. I got into comics because I had crushes on Hugh Jackman and Halle Berry in the first X-Men movie.
Okay, like it's a lot of spandex and.
I was in high school.
The behind the scenes of how they couldn't move in those costumes,
yes,
so they had like hop around.
Yes, I super like that movie unlocked something in my brain that was like, no, you like this. Like, this is fun. It's ridiculous. I was in high school at the time. My best friend and I would call each other, because like this is, 2001. Yeah. My best friend and I would call each other on our landlines at home, and we would answer the phone with "Prove it, you're a dick," the famous line between Cyclops and Wolverine in that movie. Like I was obsessed with this movie. And then I think it was the next year for Christmas was Ultimate X-Men Volume 1 came out. So it was the first trade paperback of Ultimate X-Men, had nothing to do with the movies, complete disconnect besides the characters. Yeah. But my dad went to our closest comic shop and got me the first 2 volumes, I think, for Christmas that year. And then he also went on a hunt in that same comic shop to find titles that he had read when he was a kid. So he wasn't like hardcore into comics, but he loved Sergeant Rock and the Silver Surfer. Those were his 2 things. And very brief aside, my dad loves Sergeant Rock so much that when I started working at the AV Club and when we won the Eisner, my dad was like, hey, can you use your quote unquote industry clout to bring Sergeant Rock back? And I was like, Dad, I think you vastly overestimate my ability to do anything about this. And then literally the next year, DC put out a Christmas special where Franco Francophilia and Tom Kidd did a Sergeant Rock Christmas short in the Christmas special. So I got to give my dad a new Sergeant Rock comic, and that was like the best gift. I'm never gonna top that. So
my dad's also a huge Sergeant Rock fan, and when Snyder was doing death metal, I'm like, hey, look, at least Sergeant Rock's relevant for second. Like, this is not what I wanted. This is
not even a little bit. No. So my dad is a veteran, but he was also, and he hates it when I call him this, he was a huge hippie. He went to Woodstock. Like, he was that kind of, late 60s, early 70s veteran. So Silver Surfer totally makes sense as like something he would be into, but he bought me just like a couple of random back issues of stuff. And so that's how I got into reading it. And then I went off to college, and I met, unfortunately, some real idiot teenage boys that were like, oh, you've never read The Dark Knight. Oh, you've never read blah, blah, blah. So I started, borrowing stuff from the university library, very, very much into Vertigo. I abandoned the X-Men pretty quickly, honestly, because I was like, wow, there are no people of color. There are no queer people. There's just nothing here for me, which is a bummer. And it bums me out to this day. But Vertigo was like my jam when I first started getting into like buying my own comics. And I actually went to graduate school to write about Batman. specifically The Dark Knight. I, at the time in undergrad, I actually got my degree for teaching. And one of the things that I noticed was teaching history to high school students, teenagers, there was this like fundamental shift in the fact that like the teachers that were significantly older than I was kept thinking about things in terms of like black and white. There's good guys and bad guys in history. And number one, that's not true.
Yeah, very much.
Number two, it's not how the students were viewing it. So they were resisting learning history because it was being put in a context that they were like fundamentally disagreeing with.
Yeah.
And I decided what I wanted to write about was the way that pop culture informs our understanding of history. And so I wanted to use The Dark Knight to talk about Reagan and Thatcher era 80s and how like pop culture like The Dark Knight helps to shape our understanding of what constitutes good and bad, and specifically in this time period. So
do you come from the same belief I kind of do, that people love to forget about the politics that in The Dark Knight?
Oh, 100%. I think people love to forget about the politics in comics generally.
Yeah, true.
And
yeah.
like the Dark Knight specifically.
That book to me, and it's like, hey, you should read this. It's dark and gritty. I'm like, yes, but do you understand what it's saying?
Right, exactly. I mean, like, I have my own problems with what Frank Miller creates, like generally, but like that book is not what people think it is, in the same way that like Fight Club is not the book that people think it is, you know, like there's context and nuance and layers that people like forgetting because it's punchy and grim and dark, right? And so I
present those subtexts as well as the book does. So most people who just know
100%
are like, it's about fighting.
Yep, exactly. And I think so. I went to graduate school 2007 to 2008, and at the time I had a really hard time convincing my professors that comics were something worth exploring, because they were from very old school, like classic anthropology. And like the worst part was like, I'm in a class about Dracula. So Dracula, which was literally pulp fiction, is okay, but Batman isn't. Like, where's the disconnect, you know? And I finished my classes, and then literally later that year, Iron Man 1 came out. And all of a sudden, everybody was like, let's talk about the cultural impact of comics. And I'm like, God damn it. I was literally like 6 months early. Okay. Like, all right, that is what it is. But I mean, I continued reading like on my own just because I love comics. I didn't often have like a pull list or anything. I was just buying trades or graphic novels as I found stuff that I liked. And a lot of that had to do with my LCS was kind of toxic at that point. You know, it just wasn't in a good place. And then I found a great LCS that had a ladies' night. It was the first ladies' night in Chicago. So like just genuinely having a great time. And I started writing about comics on some now defunct blogs, essentially, that every once in a while, IO9, which is now part of Gizmodo, or Jezebel would be like, hey, look at this thing. And I wrote a piece under a pseudonym. You literally cannot find it. It's been deleted from the internet, about the issue of Captain America that came out right after Winter Soldier, where Sam had sex with a girl that in the previous issue had been a teenager, but thanks to like comics timeline was now an adult, but it wasn't clear, and she was drawn the same. And so I wrote about like what was going on, because when that happened, there was like this big hubbub in a lot of like women and queer and femme spaces that like comics, that was like, what the fuck, we're so sick of this. It was very much like the era of the Escher girls, of like redrawing shit that just isn't physically possible. And I had like a throwaway line in that piece about Dan Slott when he did the whole story arc about Doc Ock taking over Peter's body and having sex with a woman under the assumption that he was Peter, not Doc Ock. And so Dan Slott started harassing me and all of my friends. So and he did that while he was at a Marvel writers retreat. And I decided if he was going to get paid to be a dickhead, I was going to get paid to write about how bad his work was. Yeah. And that's when I applied for the AV Club gig. So Batman is my true origin story, but Dan Slott is my villain origin story. And I just wanted to like get that out there of like, yeah, I started with the X-Men, I fell in love with Batman, and then Dan Slott made me mad enough to do this professionally. So yeah.
It's really weird how a lot of writers, and I can't say it's all male writers, but I feel like it's all straight writers, do the body swap thing and don't understand why it's bad in some ways.
Yep.
I
Yep.
mean, we just saw with in the myriad of reasons why that movie isn't great, with Wonder Woman 1984.
Mm-hmm.
And now you're talking about the Dan Slott storyline, and there's other storylines that do it too. It's just like, no, it's fine because it's still their body. It's like, yeah, but is it? Is it?
I mean, Psylocke is the perfect example, right?
Yeah.
Like 30 years of having a white woman's brain trapped in an Asian woman's body. Like, it is a trope in comics, and I understand it's a trope for a reason, but I don't know that it's ever been done in a way that felt worth the trouble, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many tropes in sci-fi and then translated into comics that just came from bad backgrounds that very rarely get redeemed anymore, it seems.
Yeah.
And I know there's writers out there who can do it. They just don't get the spotlight to do it. Like, I mean, everybody's talking about how X Factor just got canceled. It's like, that's a place to use those tropes. Like, that is 100% a place to use those tropes and get through them and figure out how to redeem them in some ways or tell a compelling narrative with them.
And it's not lost on me that a lot of the books that get the chance to do it and then, get canceled for whatever reason, especially at Marvel, they tend to be written by people that are willing to experiment, and they also tend to be written by people that are not white cis dudes, like you were saying. Like, it's a very that I think, and this is why, like, anytime somebody starts talking about comics, I'm like, union, like, when are we getting a union? Because one of the big challenges you have with comics just generally is that nobody has job security.
Yeah.
Like, theoretically, people like Brian Michael Bendis or Dan Slott even have job security. But then you look at folks like Matt Fraction and Kelly Sue DeConnick, who just frankly have not done any major comics work in the last couple of years because they've gone to TV, because you make more money and you have better job security. And it's like, I don't blame them. I just don't.
I don't agree with a lot of his politics, but like Jimmy Palmiotti says all the time, he's like, hey, like the big two don't care. Like, we don't get work anymore, and we were making them tons of books that were doing well, but now they don't call, like, and so now they went to Kickstarter, because Kickstarter, at least for them, is some kind of security, because if it works, it works.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
Yeah, it goes to like our big topic that I want to talk about for this, because you know way more about this stuff than I do. I know a base level knowledge with it, but like, what is the field of like maybe getting labor unions in comic books, and like what's the challenges that are currently happening and stuff?
So and this goes, like, I know that unions are not the answer to every situation. I do want to like caveat that. I know that unions can be problematic. I know that unions can often be fraught places, especially for folks that are marginalized in other ways. Like the Teamsters union, absolutely can be racist. There are corrupt unions out there. So I don't want anybody to think that I think that like unions are like a silver bullet at all.
Yeah,
but
it's one of those things too. People always are like, well, this is the exception that proves rules. Like, but that's the thing, like nothing's perfect, so we have to think about this as tactfully as possible.
Exactly. And like, so when the Eddie Berganza news broke, one of the things, like my editor emailed me, and at the time I was the only non-dude writing about comics for the AV Club, and my editor emailed me and said, hey, do you want to write about this? And I said, yes, but you need to understand it's going to be about unions. And my editor, who has since left the AV Club, is now in charge of the Democratic Socialists of America group in Wisconsin. So like, she was like, yes, absolutely, unions, let's do it. And I got a bunch of DMs after that piece went live, because my whole argument was Eddie Berganza was an employee. He was employed by Warner Brothers, and so like, DC Comics, to be an editor, and his entire cadre of people that he was in charge of were all freelancers. And HR is not there to protect people, it's there to protect the company.
Yeah.
So if these were freelancers going to HR saying Eddie Berganza is doing this awful, terrible stuff, the freelancers just got fired, because it was cheaper and more effective and easier to just say, nope, we're not even dealing with that. And that was the freelancers that were willing to come forward, right? Like, so many people, because they don't have job security, we're just going to like deal with the situation as best as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And the people that maybe could have leveraged their capital at DC, and I don't want to name names, but like, there are people that, like I said, theoretically have job security at the big two, right? those people still don't have true job security. They can be dismissed. And so I understand why big names don't come forward and talk about stuff, because especially if you're talking about someone that the vast majority of their money comes from convention experiences and it supports them and their spouse, or them, their spouse, and their children, or whatever, they don't want to endanger their entire family unit trying to take on a systemic problem, especially if the problem does not directly affect them. I understand it. I don't necessarily agree with it, but I get it. And the whole
the jump on that point though is like the era of superstar creators having so much power has kind of died in a lot of ways too. Like you don't have Neil Adams fighting for creator rights, because back then Neil Adams, if he left a book, everybody knew and everybody dropped the book. But now if a writer leaves a book, they're like, okay, well, we'll see who comes along next. Like that's kind of how comics have turned into.
Exactly. And it's hard. It's really hard, because especially layered on top of the fact that IP owners, especially, so I'm mostly talking about the big two, but folks that own IP are a very different thing. Like companies that own IP are a different thing than companies that publish creator owned work. And it's one of the arguments I get into with people a lot is it's not just the big two, it's probably the big like 6 or 7. Because there is DC and Marvel, but there's also Image, Dark Horse, Dynamite, Valiant. Like there's other publishers out there that own IP. And if you look at Marvel does not directly publish their middle grade and younger books. IDW publishes that stuff. So IDW has the license to publish Marvel middle grade, and YA books is where the money is right now. All of the money that's coming into graphic novels, like I don't think anybody can argue that Raina Telgemeier is the reigning, and Jean Luen Yang are like the reigning king and queen of comics right now. Not because of the floppies, not because of their adult content, because of their YA and middle grade work. And like you layer that on top of all these other issues, and you get to the point where it is incredibly easy for one bad apple in any of those companies to become a massive problem for everybody, because no one has the leverage to do anything about it. And basically anytime you hear a story about nobody in blank company or blank industry has leverage, in my mind, the solution to that is collective action. When you talk about page rates and the fact that they're all over the place and some companies are really bad at paying people promptly, a union would help take care of that. When you talk about the fact that everybody has to pay for healthcare individually if they can afford to pay for it at all, a union would take care of that. When you talk about harassers in the industry, a union could take care of that. And again, unions are not a panacea, but if you look at like WGA or even SAG, like there are models for creative contract-based industries that people are protected at least a little bit more. They are given the opportunity to negotiate for healthcare that is better, for pay rates that are better. And I think that that's where I always come down on it, is like, if everybody teams up, great. The problem is that every single company, and this is not just in comics, this is a capitalism problem, right? Every single company has tried to convince us that the only way to succeed is to be the cheapest, the fastest, and the best, all three. And that's got to sacrifice health more than anything else. And it sucks. It sucks a lot that like capitalism and comics specifically have kind of convinced everybody that the only way to succeed is to damage your health. It's similar to like comedians, right? Like how many people do we talk about like, oh, they're funny because they're damaged? Well, they're damaged because they don't have any money. It's kind of, and the only exceptions to those rules that I can see are incredibly small publishers that have been very strategic and very intentional and have pay rates that are very transparent. But those aren't employers. Those still aren't employers. They are publishers that have contracts. So like when I think about publishers that I universally support, it's like Iron Circus. Spike Trotman, cream of the crop in my mind, finds amazing books, backs amazing creators, and just continually pulls out really, really good content. And by all accounts is wonderful to work with and pays really well comparatively. But not everybody makes content that Iron Circus wants to publish. So like everybody else is just kind of shit out of luck, which sucks.
And with comics too, it seems like a lot of these problems are open secrets in a way. Like I think about the biggest one that comes to mind recently is the page rate for colorists at Boom. Like,
yup,
for like a good solid month, everybody was talking about like, this is ridiculous. No one should be paid for so low for such like colorists work really hard to get the books out, and they're getting paid like I think it was like $50 a page or something like ridiculously low. And people are still like big name people still pumping out books through Boom to this day. It's like because they have to work, like no matter what, they have to work. And there's so many creators who are like, if I don't finish this page, I'm tired. Like I think about Mitch Gerrits all the time because he has so many back problems. He's like, I have to finish these pages. My back is killing me. I have to finish these pages on Twitter. And I'm like, you need to have a break.
There was a guy that finished coloring pages in the room where his wife was going into labor while their child was born. Yeah, like that is not an effective or workable solution. You know, like that is a sign of a broken industry, that the way for someone to pay for their kid to be born is to work through their kid being born.
Yeah.
You know,
in the same way with comedians, we pay especially artists and comic books in a way of like, oh look, they're such good dedicated artists that they're doing all of this during strife, and it's like maybe that's not the thing we should get out of this, out of this right. We're looking at right now.
I mean, in the last like 2-3 weeks, we've lost 3 pretty like sizable names that were all, I think, in their 40s. Like Jean-Paul Leon was 49, Patrick Dean was 45, Jesse Ham just passed away. I think he was either in his late 30s or early 40s. And like Paul Dean and Jean-Paul Leon were both ill for quite a while. Like Patrick Dean had ALS, and like I don't want to compare the two because they're not exactly the same, but like one of my favorite stories about like classic literature is that J.R.R. Tolkien would just really suck at being a professor, so his students would all drop his class so that he would be paid to be a professor while he was writing all of his works for Lord of the Rings and Hobbit. He was intentionally a bad teacher so that his students would leave him alone. And we hear these stories about him and C.S. Lewis and other people, that the only way that they could succeed at being a writer at this time, and like someone that turned into like a tentpole writer, right? Like these are bastions of their genres, is because their wives took care of literally everything else in their life.
Yeah.
And I
sorry, I didn't mean to talk over your point.
No. That's just, I know that folks like want to be more engaged, right? Yeah. Like you see Scott Snyder talking about his kids, or like, you know, again, using Matt Fraction and Kelly Sue DeConnick as an example, they're very open about like their relationship with their kids and the fact that like they have help that yeah, exactly. Like they're very open about the fact that they want to be engaged, involved parents, but like those are people that are in the upper echelons of fame and pay in the industry. Yeah. So they have resources that other folks might not have access to. Yeah. And like, it's like, this is a fundamental flaw of capitalism that has been really tipped into a place of emergency by the fact that comics has turned into a gig economy job instead of an employee job. And that's a big part of it, is that it's all based on contracts and you could be dismissed at any time. You're not an employee, you're a freelancer.
And I think about how like we as Western comic readers view Eastern comic creators. Like I think about manga a lot when it comes to sickness with creators there, because they get sick all the time because they're working. I mean, putting out a chapter every week is insane. And I think about I do not remember his name off the top of my head, but the creator of Hunter x Hunter and Yu Yu Hakusho. Like Yu Yu Hakusho ended early because he was so sick, and now Hunter x Hunter is on the hiatus because he's always so sick. And people are like, well, see, he should take better care of himself. Like, do you not see that that's the same thing that's happening here? But at least they get residuals for the IP they create, while everybody here has to work for big 2 companies and only work with their IP. Like
they also
be a millionaire because he made One Piece. No one that worked on Batman gets to be a millionaire, except for Bob Kane back in the day, maybe.
And they also get a marketing infrastructure. So I worked in marketing just long enough to learn some of the stupid shit, right? And when you look at IP, so if DC doesn't promote a book, it dies.
Yeah.
Like unless it's like a book that's been around forever, like Detective Comics or, Wonder Woman or whatever. If DC does not market a book, it dies. And we see that all the time with Marvel. We see that all the time with anybody that owns IP.
Yeah.
And then when you go over to Image, and this is something that I say that a lot of people don't agree with, and I get it. A lot of people want to like Image better because it's not IP, so theoretically it should be better.
Mm-hmm.
Image is not a publisher, it's a printing press.
Yeah.
Image does not provide you with an editor or a colorist or a letterer or a designer. Image does not provide you with marketing support.
Yep.
Unless you are already a top tier creator. If you're coming to Image and you pitch them something and they decide to print it, they will pay to print it and they will pay to send it out to stores, but you are in charge of telling people to buy it and you are in charge of getting people to buy it. And if you don't succeed, your book gets canceled.
Yeah.
And we talk about like small creators. It's the same thing as people that own small like art businesses, right? You have to be the person that's doing the content, but then you also have to be the head of marketing, the head of accounting. Because if you're a freelancer and you have 8 different gigs coming in, no one has ever taught you how to file your taxes. No one's ever taught you how to budget, like that's its own job on top of just living your life. Like you have to be essentially a small business owner. And there's no resources of support. And like some people have like an agent, but the agent may or may not be able to help you with marketing. That's probably more for a manager or a PR manager.
Yeah.
And even the PR managers are freelance. Like all of the PR managers I work with that are not at like traditional book publishing or DC and Marvel, they're all freelancers that work for individual people. The whole system, soup to nuts, is framed around the idea that everything is a gig job, and it makes it hard to have resources, and it makes it hard to unionize too, right? Because like it's not like there's like a there's no water cooler, right? Like there's no like central location where everyone can start talking about a union. And then you add on top of that like personal beefs. Like there are people that if we were to have a union, I would not want them in the union because they've been complete dickheads to me and my friends.
Yeah.
That's not a valid reason to kick somebody out of a union, but like I still don't like them,
Yeah.
So
I get that.
It's complicated and it's hard.
And even at conventions, like when you have time to get creators together to talk about things like this, like
right, because you're trying to scramble to make money.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
and I've noticed too with having the privilege of talking to a lot of creators who have done a lot of creator owned and a lot of big 2 work. It seems like it's a double-edged sword with both of those, where they either get burned out with the politics at the big 2 because they're being pulled apart at every turn, it seems, with like the stuff they can and can't do with IP because it's a company on IP, versus just being exhausted because they've had to pitch book after book after book and market it for years just to get to the point where the big 2 would be interested in them. And that gave them some kind of security in a sense of like, well, at least if I can work for them, I know my book will at least get published and I can get all the people I need on it. It's interesting to see some really big creators talk to me about that and see them bounce back and forth between them because they either get exhausted by one or exhausted by the other and have to switch.
Yeah. And I don't blame anybody for making a choice that keeps a roof over their head.
Yeah.
Like ultimately. And that's part of why, like, when people get angry, especially when they get angry at marginalized creators.
Yeah.
Like if you get angry at someone who is queer or BIPOC or a woman or a person with a disability, if you get angry at them for not speaking out about industry abuse, you are asking them to endanger their livelihoods.
Yeah.
And that's when I'm like, no, I truly do not give a shit. Like that's the people that I'm angry at are the people who have at least some semblance of job security. And by and large, that's white cis straight dudes.
Yeah.
And that's, I think that's really important to like very specifically stay. Is I can be disappointed. I can be sad that someone that I like and respect is not speaking up, but I am never going to be angry at them because at the end of the day, they need to feed themselves.
And already half their feeds are self-promoting because they have to, and so like they don't,
right,
even if they wanted to, they probably don't have time to put thoughts together to say anything on a public forum, because if they do that, they're taking away from promoting.
And depending on which publishers they work with, they might have a clause in their contract saying they can't speak out.
Yeah, that's
Like,
also very true.
it's there's so many ways, and I'm a socialist, but like there's so many ways that capitalism have basically shaped every industry, but especially this industry. Like,
Yeah.
and the same can be said of like animation, the same can be said of video games. Frankly, the same can be said of people that work in traditional book publishing.
Yeah.
If you look at book authors, like they have a lot more in common with like folks that write and draw comics than anybody else. And it's part of the reason why I was so excited when I found out that the SFWA, Science Fiction Writers Association, they have expanded their union eligibility to include some people that write comics.
Oh, that's good.
And they are continually working to continue to expand their eligibility, because they also want to include romance, because the Romance Writers of America has turned into like such a huge clusterfuck of racism that the SFWA, which is mostly run by now women and people of color, has just been continually trying to expand who can fall into their union so that they can help people. And I'm like, that's why I keep saying, like, if we can get SFWA, if we can get people into SFWA and we can have people see the benefits of unionization and we can learn from what SFWA has done, we might be able to turn around and leverage that in comics. And I think it's going to take a long time, but I'm excited about the possibility.
And it's interesting too, to see more and more creators kind of get agents, which I didn't know was really a thing until I started paying attention to like their contact information, trying to get a hold of them. It was like, oh, talk to my agent. I'm like, oh, this is like, at least for me, it feels like getting an agent is a stepping stone to unionizing and getting better contracts and better deals, because you at least now have someone on your side fighting for you in that way.
Yep. And someone who has like the business side knowledge, because that's such a big part of it. I think that raises another challenge though of our agents. Would agents be included in the union? And I don't know the answer to that question.
A current fight technically right now for like the movie industry is getting agents kind of unionized over there too.
Yeah. So agents and like if you are a SAG, which is the Screen Actors Guild, SAG, if you're a SAG card holder, you have to be on-screen talent, to my understanding. You cannot be an agent, you cannot be a manager, you can't be an assistant, which puts a lot of people who are adjacent to that industry in danger. And then if you're crew, most screen jobs, be it TV, commercial, movie, whatever, most screen jobs are either advertised as union only or non-union. So there are jobs that are only available to union crew. And so the people that fall through the cracks are the people that are adjacent to crew and cast, right? Which is, like I said, agents, managers, assistants to individuals, not like assistant producers and whatnot. And I think the same would definitely happen with comics, is like, all right, so we can assume that if you are directly responsible for the production of a book, which would absolutely be writer, inker, penciler, colorist, the flatter for the colorist, letterer, a designer, we can absolutely say that those ones are 100%. If you're an editor, are you eligible? Are you only eligible if you're a freelance editor, not an employee of a company? If you are comics criticism or journalism like me, are you eligible? What constitutes published work? Does self-published work count? I say it should, but I can see an argument to say no. And that's I think the logistics of a union is just terrifying to a lot of people. And it's not the sort of thing that like you can sit down in a room and have 5 people make a decision, right? Like, and I think that that's part of the thing that the hurdle that it would have to get over. So
I feel like a safe starting place is if you could be nominated for an Eisner, you should be able to get it, be a part of the union.
But then again, like some self-published work and webcomics were not eligible for Eisners until like 5 years ago.
Yeah, and I think
so like
how slow the process of just getting credits on comics is. Like, took them forever.
That is one of my like big soapboxes, and I have like a whole blog post on my site about this. If anyone is listening to this podcast and they don't know how to promote themselves in a way that makes it easier for comics journalists to find them. There's literally a post on my blog of like what you need, why you should do it, exactly like what elements should be on your portfolio site, because I can't tell you the number of times that I have tried to credit someone for something and have been completely unable to find their information because the publisher didn't put it out.
Yeah.
Like this is another element of like, you have to do this work for yourself, and it really sucks because you should be able to trust that the publisher is going to put the colorist and the flatter and the letterer and the editor and the designer on the credits for the book, but they're just not going to. So you need to do it for yourself and advocate for yourself in a way that makes it easier, because comics journalists are definitely having those conversations.
Yeah.
Like, we're pushing back on our editors saying we want to include colorists and letterers and designers in the credits. We don't just want it to be the big two creators. So please advocate for yourself, because I want to help, and so do so many other people that do what I do.
Yeah. Before we move into a small Q&A section, what do you think, for anybody listening to for this, would be the good first steps of getting labor unions in comics? I feel like the easiest answer is just start talking about it more. But
yeah,
what are some other ways you think that would be good first steps to kind of like get it going?
I think specifically sharing page rates.
Okay.
Like we talked about with the boom thing. I think sharing page rates, and a lot of this stuff is done in a whisper network already, right? Like, yeah. I know the publishers that don't pay people on time. I know them off the top of my head. But I think that if we're just a little bit more upfront about it, and I think if people organize themselves into smaller communication collectives, and that's not to say that like we can't just like go big or go home, right? But like, if you have a group of like 50 people that you know because you've met at conventions or whatever, and you're happy to set up like a Discord or a Slack with them where you can talk about page rates and you can talk about editors that are being assholes, do that. Just do it. And like, don't be afraid to tell people your experiences in a private place. Like, it does not need to be public yet, because that could endanger your job. But like, I know that there's a comics criticism, private social groups, and if there's an opportunity to join that kind of thing, do it, because that's not going to offer all of the benefits of a union, but it's going to be a step towards a union. And I think that, and like, if you don't already follow it, there's a couple of Twitter accounts that tweet jobs that are not listed with pay rates. They retweet the link to the job with the pay rate. They'll go digging and find out what the pay rate is and say up front, like, this is what the pay rate is. And they're anonymous. I think that that's a really good way to do it as well. It's just the more information and the more people talk, the better.
So thank you so much though for talking to me about the union, because I feel like, as someone who worked in retail for too long, anti-union talk has always rubbed me the wrong way in a lot of because as it should, and getting more and more educated throughout my life about unions. I feel like it's something that should be talked about more, and in comic books it doesn't seem like it's talked about enough. So I really appreciate you coming on talking to me about it.
Yeah, absolutely. If I can see a comic book union in my lifetime, I will be a happy camper. So
the first question I had, though, not about unions or anything of the sort, is if you didn't have to spend so much time taking people and companies to task, which we all appreciate you doing, but if you didn't have to, because I feel like it's half of your Twitter account is just telling people, hey, knock it off. What would you be doing with your time?
Oh God. I think I'd spend a lot more energy plugging stuff that I like.
Okay.
And Oliver Sava, who works at the AV Club with me, he and I have had this conversation pretty in depth, and I've had a similar one with Tiffany Babb, who's also at the AV Club with me. We make really specific decisions about what we're going to cover, like on the site versus on our personal Twitter. And I try really hard to make sure that I am, the vast majority of the time, bringing attention to something that I think is really good. And especially if I think that not a lot of people are talking about it. because I don't want to be a negative Nancy all the time. But unfortunately, so much crappy stuff happens that I just have to yell a lot on social media.
Yeah.
And I would much rather be like, hey, I am reading a really, really, really cute manga and I would like to yell about it with people.
Yeah.
Like I want to tell you about this joyful experience I'm having with a book. And I get to do that sometimes. I just get so burnt out on talking about the negative stuff that sometimes I'm like, I don't even want to read a comic today because I'm just so tired. And I'm so tired of knowing, you know. I know I'm not alone in that. Like when you get the DM or the text message from a family member that's like, hey, have you heard about the new Joss Whedon show? And I'm like, do I want to tell them why I'm not watching that? Or do I just want to tell them thanks for the tip? Like,
yeah. I have a lot of friends who are like, man, Castlevania season 4. I'm like, yeah, but should we talk about Warren Ellis?
Right. Yeah. Like, it's so hard. It's so hard to be.
People work on those products that aren't the one person.
Yes.
And so it gets really rough. Yeah, it gets really rough.
It's so hard to find, and everybody's line is going to be totally different, right? Like everybody's comfort place is going to be different. But man, I just
person getting extremely mad at me.
And like, okay, so like my dad texts me about the Nevers, the new Joss Whedon show, and he's like, have you heard about it? And I'm like, oh yeah, I've heard some things about it, and just left it at that. Because I love my dad and I don't want to have an in-depth text message conversation with my father about why that's a problem. Like that's just it, versus like if I have I have a couple friends that recently discovered the Dirk Gently TV show, and I had to break the news to them. Max Landis is a piece of shit, and he's been a piece of shit for a long time, which is a super big bummer for me personally, because one of my favorite Superman stories is the Superman American Alien that he did.
Yeah,
I love that mini.
Yeah.
And it's such a bummer because he's such a piece of shit. And I'm like,
I have a hard time because I thought Green Valley was a really cool comic.
Right. And like, if I could trust that people were like, I think this goes back to what you and I were talking about a little bit before we started recording.
Yeah.
If I could go back to a time when I didn't know any of this stuff, all I did at that point is talk about what I liked and why I liked it.
Yeah.
I would love to be able to trust that everyone was behaving themselves and getting paid on time, and that no one was being mistreated or abused, because then I could just talk about how cool and how great comics are and how much I love comics.
Yeah.
So I would love to do that.
I personally don't like being the guy that ruins everything to some of my friends.
It's hard. It's hard to be a Debbie Downer.
Yeah, and like we talked about it briefly too, like when I started doing this podcast and learning so much stuff that just been kind of not in the public eye through reading people doing the work you do and just in general discussion. It's like, man, why do I hate the thing that brought me so much joy all of a sudden? And it's a weird thing where you have to start digesting that in a different way to get back to enjoying the thing. Like I still love comics, but now I have a tepid sense of like, yes, but who got hurt in some way while I'm reading? Where I have to like, okay, push that away while you're reading. And then when you're done reading, then start thinking about it again. And so you can at least still have that sense of joy in some ways, but also not completely doing what everybody else does, which is pushing it under the rug.
Yeah, exactly.
My next question was, because this, I said we're going to talk about superhero movies because I really want to know this now that I know that you don't like the first Captain America movie. Is there one superhero movie that you do enjoy with almost no issues, or is there like all of them are like there's just too much problems?
Oh, this is the easiest question. This is the Blade. The first Blade movie is a perfect superhero movie. And I know that some people will argue it's not a superhero movie because vampires, whatever. Blade is a Marvel character that has been included in like X-Men and Avengers and all of those other Marvel properties. The first Blade movie is a perfect film. I can't tell you the number of times I've watched that movie. One of my dearest friends in the whole world, Carlin, has written these incredibly interesting academic essays about the role of Black women in vampire movies, and specifically in that movie. It's just, I fucking love Blade. I love Blade so much.
Yeah, it's funny. People are like, anybody that says Blade isn't like a real superhero, I'm like, guys, he's literally the main character of the Marvel crossover that Jason Aaron is doing right now.
Right.
He's the only one that
I get it. I get that. I get that, like, some people think that it's like a different kind of category. And I'm like, I think that that's rooted, number one, in that weird divide between magic and technology and superhero comics, which I don't. Yeah. And number two, I think it's rooted in racism. But like, I think, and I've said this before, Blade walked so that the whole MCU could run.
Yeah.
And like, yes, Blade, like, if I don't think if Tim Burton hadn't done his Batmans, I don't think that Blade could have happened. And if the Christopher Reeve Superman hadn't happened, I don't think Tim Burton could have done it. Like, there's this cascade of things. And I think it all actually goes back to radio dramas, like The Shadow and the Green Hornet and whatnot. But like, I truly do not think that we would have the modern MCU without Blade. And I am really, really excited to see the new, like, what Mahershala Ali and like that whole crew is going to do with it.
Yeah. I have a big chip on my shoulder that says, like, without the Fletcher Superman cartoons, I feel like we wouldn't have movies like we do now, just because of how those cartoons portrayed superheroes in a way.
Yep.
My last question for you is kind of like a space now for you to talk about things you like. Who are some of your favorite journalists in the comic space that you learned from, and kind of like when you see their posts or see the things that they've written in the past, like, okay, now I'm ready to do my work.
Yes. Oh my gosh. So it is really cool and also kind of intimidating to be in such a small group of people, right? Like, comics is not a big industry, and comics journalism is not a big industry. Like, it's a smaller within a smaller, right? But I think, and I am so worried that I'm going to mess up his name. This is the worst. Hold on. Let me make sure. Cause I'm like,
every time I talk to anybody.
George Marston.
Okay. Yeah.
George Marston has been working with Chris Arendt over at what is now, I think, Games Radar. It used to be called something else.
Yeah. Drama, right?
Yeah. Thank you. His work on NFTs lately, because he has done some deep dives into like the industry impact of NFTs, the individual impact of NFTs, the environmental impact of NFTs. Like, his work has just been so incredible. And I'm so excited to read that sort of thing, because I know that it's like really inside baseball. It's the sort of thing of like, when I start talking about, before Disney bought Fox, obviously, like, who owned which IP, right? Like, nobody wants to talk about that. But it is something that, like, if you have a fundamental understanding of how all of the money works in the industry, you have a much better understanding of how politics and the culture work in the industry. So just that is huge for me. And then literally everyone that's ever worked at Women Write About Comics. So like Nola and Claire and Corey and like Kat and like literally anybody that's worked there.
Yeah.
J.A. Michelin is not writing about comics anymore, and for a very brief time worked at the AV Club with me and Oliver. Jam's stuff, just go look it up. Like, her piece on what Mark Waid did with Strange Fruit, like, holy shit, just holy shit. There's some such incredible work out there, and like, Women Write About Comics so deserved their Eisner last year, and I'm so mad that it got overshadowed by all of the like IT security problems.
Yeah.
Because some of them refused the Eisner because of it. And I'm like, it's such a bummer, because they've been so consistently putting out some of the best work.
Yeah.
So and like Steve, oh my God, Steve Morris over at Shelf Dust. He used to be part of the MNT. Shelf Dust does some, and I know I work with them a little, like, every once in a while, but like Steve is doing this whole series about Batman's greatest enemy, and everybody picks somebody different. Nobody's repeated. So like, some people say it's the Joker, some people say it's Two-Face, some people say it's himself, some people say it's origin stories. So it gets into this like really fascinating meta conversation.
Yeah.
And Steve is so good at identifying people that have really interesting opinions and can really back them up. So there's just, thank you for ending on this question, because I'm jazzed now, because this is what I like talking about. I like plugging things that are cool and neat and smart. And like Shelf Dust, Women Write About Comics, and then Chris and George over at Newsarama, like they're just doing some cool stuff. And it's so hard because so much of the time, sometimes all you get is like press releases.
Mm-hmm.
And like you're like, well, I don't want to just copy and paste somebody's press release. Like I want to do something cool and neat, but that doesn't pay very well. So yeah, but yeah, those are some of the folks that I'm like, and then I know it sounds really funny, but like I always end up going back to like Umberto Eco and Joseph Campbell. Like if you're going to talk about literature analysis and you're going to talk about cultural analysis and the impact of pop culture, you go to the old school names. And they never wrote directly about comics, but like, who boy, Joseph Campbell can teach you a lot about why you like the comics you like.
I have fallen asleep a few times to Joseph Campbell work, just myself trying to understand the hero's journey.
I don't blame you. If you haven't checked out Umberto Eco, so when I went to graduate school, it was for anthropology, right? It was for literature analysis, specifically about the Dark Knight. But Umberto Eco was an Italian anthropologist who was also a popular fiction author.
Okay.
So he figured out how to write popular fiction that teaches you about literature analysis.
Okay.
So if you want to read something a little more interesting, I think you might like him.
Oh, thank you. And then lastly, then Caitlin, where can people find you in all of your work?
Yeah, I am at Crossberg, C Rosberg on Twitter. That's probably the main one. And in the AV Club once a month. And I've got some stuff coming out on Shelf Dust in I think June or July. Sweet. So those are the big places. Yeah.
And you can find this show on Twitter at YComicsPod, Facebook at facebook.com/YComicsPodcast. You can email me at ycomicspodcast@gmail.com. If you want to be a guest on the show, have questions for future guests, or have a story about how comics impacted your life that you want read on air, you can reach me at any of those places. Please leave a review if you like the show and tell a friend. I would like to get this show to more people if possible, so I need to start pushing it more. Logo for the show is done by my friend Andy Manley, and you can find his work on The Simpsons because he is a production assistant on there. I always forget to talk about that.
Cool.
Yeah, this is a completely side. I've worked with Andy on my 2 short story collections I did. He did all the art in them. We did an illustration for each story, and I'm like, "You're working on The Simpsons now, man. You interned with South Park. What's wrong with? Why did you work with me?" And the banners are done by my friend Steven. The theme is "Join the Restaurant" by David Szesztay. And remember, everybody, that Captain America punched Nazis.